Story 1. The Screaming Woman at the Motel. In the early 90s, way back before I got married and had kids or pulled my head out of my butt and generally got my life together, I had this girlfriend. I was madly in love with her, and I thought she was perfect and believed that we would spend the rest of our lives together. Then one day, I found her in bed with a coworker after coming home from work early. And so I grabbed a bag, packed everything I could not afford to lose, and then walked her out. About an hour later, I was pulling into a motel about 15 miles out of town. It was not the first one I saw, but it was the first that seemed like I would not wake up to find my car stolen. So I pulled in, booked a room for a week, and then asked the clerk where the nearest liquor store was. I got blasted that first night, and then woke up so hungover that I poured the rest of that second bottle of vodka down the bathroom sink. It was clear alcohol was not going to fix anything. And so, after loading up on beef and cheese at a nearby burger place, I headed back to my motel room and went to sleep. Maybe 3 hours later, I woke up at around 9:30 at night, and then dragged myself into the shower to rinse away the cobwebs. I figured that I was in for a chill evening of TV and maybe a pizza delivery if the clerk on the front desk knew of one that would drive out that far. But I walked back into the bedroom to the sound of someone yelling in the parking lot outside. I peeked out of the curtains after I toweled off and threw on some clothes and saw a woman standing at the far end of the parking lot having some kind of public freakout. She was yelling at the clerk from the front desk, but from that distance and being behind the window, I could not make out what she was saying. I guess seeing someone else having a hard time made me feel a little bit better about my own. At least, that is what I blame for the curiosity getting the better of me. And then, within a few seconds of seeing her, I was outside on the walkway smoking a cigarette and pretending not to watch the drama unfold. But the second I heard what she was talking about, I did not find it nearly as entertaining as I thought I would. I guess that probably makes me sound like some kind of a-hole, but who does not enjoy a harmless little confrontation between two pissed-off strangers? The woman looked like she was in her late 20s or early 30s. She had black hair, tan skin, and wore jeans, sneakers, and a white t-shirt. And in between yelling for the clerk to shut up and listen to her, she kept saying crazy stuff like, "We need to get everyone out, and they are all going to die." I remember thinking, wait, what? And taking a few steps toward the parking lot so I could hear what they were saying better. The clerk was trying to calm her down, saying that he would call the cops, but the woman did not want to hear it. She kept telling the guy, "The cops will not be able to do crap. They would end up dead too. You need to get everyone out of here right now." I wasn't the only person to overhear all of this, and as the yelling continued, more and more people started coming out of their rooms to see what all the commotion was about. A few kids came out with their parents, but they were quickly ushered back inside when they heard the lady screaming about an imminent mass murder. It was so convincing that I kept thinking, is this girl having some kind of mental breakdown here in the parking lot of a motel? Or is this real? Are people actually coming to kill us? It seemed like a terrible thing to take a gamble on. People on the second floor were obviously thinking the same thing, because while some went back into their rooms looking very worried, one guy came out again with his car keys in hand, clearly getting ready to run if anything actually happened. The woman screaming sure sounded like she believed every word she was saying. She was terrified, and that fear was infectious. People were starting to get anxious. Kids were crying, and all the while she was getting more and more agitated, yelling at the crowd of onlookers, saying, "Don't you get it? We can't stay here." I felt it myself. That creeping thought of, well, damn, what if she's right? Other people were obviously thinking the same thing, and not just the guy who grabbed his car keys. People were yelling, "Just call the cops, man." Things like that. But you could tell it wasn't just because this woman was freaking out. It was because they were actually scared of the things she was saying. The clerk turned to the crowd on the second-floor balcony, which was where the shout to call the cops had come from. He started saying something back about how the situation was under control. And I think he was about to tell people to go back into their rooms when the woman seemed to completely lose her mind for a moment. I guess it was the clerk claiming that everything was under control, because as soon as those words came out of his mouth, she started pacing toward him, and he didn't realize how close she was until it was too late. He tried to back away from her, telling her to keep away, but she managed to grab him by the arm. I figured she was about to start hitting him or something, but instead she dragged his forearm toward her while leaning forward, then sank her teeth into the guy's arm so hard that I honestly think she drew blood. The clerk started screaming for his life, yelling for her to get the hell off of him, before letting out a loud screech of pain as the woman bit him. I remember the gasps and cries coming from all around the motel as she bit the man, and that prompted another handful of people to retreat back to their rooms, like they didn't want to be anywhere near whatever happened next. I'm not sure how the clerk got her off him, but I guess he had dragged her away by the hair or something and shoved her, because the next thing I knew, she was picking herself up off the ground, while the clerk ran back toward the front desk, holding his arm. As the woman kept yelling about how we were all going to die, someone walked out from behind the front desk with a gun in his hand, saying the cops had been called and she needed to leave right now before they showed up and arrested her. Once again, the lady lost control and started screaming at the top of her lungs about how the cops couldn't help anyone and they would only die too. She then started marching toward the person I later discovered was the motel manager, but he didn't make the same mistake as his employee. He backed up, keeping a distance between them as he raised the gun and told her to back off. Now, looking back on it, that's when I began to think she wasn't crazy. At least not completely crazy, because the sight of that gun pointed at her stopped her dead in her tracks. She kept backing away from the manager with the gun aimed at her, and then she turned around and saw a couple of young parents watching from the second-floor balcony, the woman holding their baby. The frantic lady ran for the stairs, begging them to hand over their baby so at least it would be spared from what was coming. She didn't even make it halfway up before the father cut her off. He tried blocking her at first, but when she swung at him, he shoved her back so hard that she tumbled down the last couple of steps. It wasn't a serious fall, so she got right back up again. But just as she was starting up the stairs toward the young father once more, the cops suddenly rolled into the parking lot and caught her attention. Their patrol car turned in with a quick wail of its siren, as if to say everything needed to stop. The manager with the gun placed it on the ground and raised his hands into the air. One of the cops jumped out and pulled his own gun, but didn't point it as the manager began explaining the situation. That same cop started walking toward him so he could secure the gun, and then told the man to head back inside until everything was sorted out. But the other cop started walking toward the woman who had been screaming, and the whole thing began all over again. At first, the lady acted somewhat relieved, like the cops were going to help her evacuate the motel. But as soon as that one cop made it clear that wasn't going to happen, she started screaming again about how they were all going to die. Only that time, she went from maybe a 5 out of 10 on the crazy scale to a full 11. She started shouting, "Why is no one listening to me? Are you all stupid or something?" And she wasn't just yelling or screaming this time. She was screeching and wailing so loudly that her voice began to break apart. Some of the words were getting mashed together in her rush to force them out. I think this was one of the most disturbing parts of the entire thing. Watching the last pieces of this woman's mind starting to slip away from her right there in front of me. She began walking toward the cop standing in front of her. He backed off and pulled out a bright yellow pistol taser, and although he didn't point it right away, just seeing him take it out sent her completely over the edge again. She rushed forward, I'm guessing, to try and bite that cop, and he didn't hesitate. He aimed his taser, fired it, and the woman's body just seemed to lock up mid-run before she hit the ground face first. It was a nasty fall, man. A really nasty fall. And then, when the cops went to put the cuffs on her, it looked like she was out cold. Not long after, the ambulance showed up, and after wrapping the woman's face with some bandages, the paramedics hauled her onto a stretcher and then drove off to what I'm guessing was the hospital, with the cops following close behind. The motel manager walked around the parking lot, basically begging people not to check out and assuring them everything was back under control. I went back into my room, grabbed my keys, and then returned to the burger joint for some fries and a milkshake. No one showed up at the motel and slaughtered everyone, but by then, I figured that wasn't going to happen. The poor woman just, I guess, lost her mind somehow and was convinced something terrible was about to happen. The thing is, something bad was about to happen, just only for her. Story 2. The Men Who Came for the Ring. My name's Marilyn. I'm a grandma from the Midwest, and many years ago now, my husband George and I drove our 2 kids all the way over to Vineland, New Jersey to spend some time with family. It made for a long trip, so long in fact that we decided it was better to spend the night in a motel rather than arrive at George's parents' place at 2 in the morning. We picked one of the more expensive options in the hopes that we'd avoid anything sketchy or seedy. And when we arrived, it was every bit as nice as we had hoped. The staff was friendly, it was clean and well managed, and our room was spacious and comfortable, with a pretty nice bathroom too. We checked in, hauled our suitcases from the trunk, and then went for a very nice dinner at a nearby bar and grill before returning to the room at around 9:30. We watched some TV together. Then, once the kids were just about ready for bed, my husband went into the bathroom to brush his teeth, while I coaxed our son and daughter under their covers. Since I promised our daughter a bedtime story that night, I was obliged to read one. But since our slightly older son was within earshot, he insisted that I tell a story about cattle-driving cowboys fighting off Indian attacks, and not one about princes and princesses finding romance and getting married. And yet, while the 3 of us negotiated some middle ground, there was a sudden and unexpected knock at the door. It was almost 10 p.m., and the unspoken arrangement in our house was that if anyone knocked that late, it was my husband who would answer the door. So, as soon as he heard the knocking, he spat and wiped his mouth, and then made his way toward the door with a very irritable look. When our son asked him, "Who is it?" he told him it was probably just one of the motel workers. But when my husband opened the door, it was not a member of the motel staff. Standing outside our motel room were 4 men. The 3 younger-looking men wore sweatsuits and were very tanned and muscular, almost like bodybuilders, while the one older man was frail and pale, but a much sharper dresser. And the older man apologized for bothering us so late, and then explained that he and his nephews would like to come inside and talk to us about something. My husband mirrored the man's approach and very politely explained that it wasn't a good time. We had a long drive ahead of us in the morning, and we were about to head to bed. And then this man countered that he really must insist, and assured my husband after a short conversation that he'd be out of our hair. My husband remained well-mannered, but made it clear that we didn't want any company, especially at such a late hour with folks that we didn't even know. And the older man didn't say anything. He just turned and nodded toward one of his nephews. One of them then reached around his back. When he brought his hand back around, I saw that he was holding a gun. Then, as the nephew held the black handgun discreetly against his thigh, the older man explained that, unfortunately, on this occasion, he wasn't asking, he was telling. Our son, our eldest kid, was smart enough to realize that something was wrong, maybe from the look on his face, or possibly from my husband's prolonged silence after the nephew produced the gun. In a whisper, my son asked me who was at the door, and I told him I didn't know, but that he needed to take his sister into the bathroom and climb into the tub together. When he asked why, I gave him an excuse that I'd used before during a far less frightening incident. And since he couldn't see past the open doorway and he hadn't seen the gun, I was able to tell him that we needed to talk about some grown-up stuff with the nice men outside. It wouldn't be for long, but he and his sister weren't allowed to listen to the grown-up talk. They had to go wait in the bathroom for a couple of minutes. When he asked if he could take a pillow, I said yes. And then he took his little sister by the hand and led her into the bathroom before shutting the door. But just as he did, I looked around to see my husband backing up with his hands raised while the men entered the room. After one of the younger men closed the door behind him, the older man invited us to take a seat on the double bed so we could get comfortable. And then, after sitting in the same chair that I had occupied a few moments before, he took out a cigarette which was lit by one of his nephews. After taking a drag, he took a look around the room and then asked us, "Pretty nice place, huh?" And in response, my husband's voice trembled with anger and fright as he asked, "What do you want?" The older man sort of tutted and shook his head. And then, after another long drag of a cigarette, he told my husband it didn't have to be like this, and that he could relax. He explained that we could reach a compromise, and when we did, he and his nephews would leave without so much as raising their voices. My husband's tone didn't change at all. He just repeated his question, and then the old man began to explain what he wanted. He said that he and the two men with him had stayed in the room just the night before, and that unfortunately he had become forgetful in his old age. He had left something in that room, something he knew the motel staff wouldn't be stupid enough to steal. And since we were the next family to occupy it, it must have been us that had found whatever he had left behind. It was then that I finally spoke up, saying that we hadn't found anything of value in the room, and that it would be a lot easier to help him if we knew what the missing item was. While the faces of the younger men stayed cold as ice, the older man smiled at me and explained what he had left behind should be in the nightstand closest to me. As I stood up to go check, the older man had to stop the nephew with the gun from pointing it at me. I was shaken, but indignant. So instead of shrinking back down onto the bed, I kept course toward the nightstand. When I opened it, I found it empty. I turned, inviting one of the younger men to come and check it for himself, so he could confirm that it was empty. No one moved. Then, with a chuckle, the older man explained how he figured that would be the case. He then went on to explain that if the nightstand was empty, then the explanation was simple. One of us had taken his property, and if we wanted to live, we would return it. It was my turn to get angry, because I figured that I had worked out the man's scam. He accused people of stealing his property, and then intimidated them until they handed over the cash value. But when I confronted him on that, he laughed again. He wasn't trying to scam anyone. All he wanted was his property back. And my husband jumped in, asking, "What property?" In response, the older man ordered us to tell our kids to come out of the bathroom. We refused at first, but then he said we could ask them to come out quietly, or one of his nephews could kick the door in and then drag them both out by the hair. He said it was our choice. So we made one, and it was me who tried to sound as calm as possible as I asked them both to come out of the bathroom. There was a pause, and everyone went quiet as the bathroom door slowly opened. Then our son led our daughter out into the bedroom by the hand. Both of them looked nervous, not terrified or on the verge of tears, just very, very anxious. The older man took on the manner of a very friendly uncle, telling the kids not to be afraid, and that he and his goons, I will call them what they were, I suppose, were friends of the family. That did not do much for them, but I guess it was better than threats. He then asked very simply and plainly if the kids had found anything while playing in the room. When both kids shook their heads, he asked if they were sure. Both silently nodded, their eyes very wide and frightened as they did. They asked them a few more times, saying things like, "You would not lie to me now, would you, kids?" But their answers did not change. Neither had found anything. The older man turned back to us with a not-so-friendly look on his face, and then asked if we understood what a difficult position we were putting him in. I was terrified, but the hypocritical question made me seethe with anger, and I snapped at him. Now, admittedly, this was very unwise, but I said it was difficult to sympathize with him, seeing as he was putting us in one of the most difficult situations in our entire lives. And then the older man stopped smiling altogether. And then, after stamping out his cigarette in an ashtray that was on the coffee table next to him, he leaned forward in his chair and asked me something I will never, ever forget. Not as long as I live. He asked me, "Is my nephew going to have to really hurt you in front of your children?" The question, or the implication at least, made my jaw drop and stunned my husband into silence. The older man deliberately mistook our silence for incomprehension and slowly repeated the question. And when he did, our little girl's eyes began to fill with tears, and she started begging the older man, "Please do not shoot them." The man explained in that same talking-to-a-child voice that he did not want to, but that Mommy and Daddy had taken something from him. Our son stayed quiet, hugging his sister closer as she started to cry. The older man turned his back to us, and for the first time, he looked truly angry as he told us, "Look what you did. Now you got your daughter crying." And then, in a voice that set every nerve on edge, he told us he did not want to strangle her to keep her quiet, but he would if he needed to. And the suggestion caused my husband's rage to boil over. He did not get up, but he just sort of seethed there with anger as he told the man, "You touch a single hair on her goddamn head." But he did not get past head before the goon with the gun suddenly pointed it at him. The older man told us to keep calm, saying he didn't want either of us upsetting our daughter more than she already was. I looked to her, burying her face in her brother's pajama shirt, and it was then that I noticed not only was one of my son's hands free, but it was searching for something in the pocket of his pajama pants. Within seconds, everyone was noticing the same thing, and we watched in silence as my son pulled something from his pocket. It was a ring, a gold one, and it appeared to have what looked like a large ruby surrounded by diamonds. And after taking it from his pocket, he held it up as if to say, "Here it is." And my husband and I were far too relieved to be angry at first. I remember George's head slowly sinking into his hands, covering his face, almost saying, "Oh, thank God." And I was still too shocked to speak at all. I just watched as the older man smiled a big wolfish smile before laughing as if the whole thing were just some big joke. And I remember how he turned to his goons and said something like, "Even after all these years, I still got it." He then gestured toward my son and told him to return the ring. Seeing my son gently push his sister to one side and walk toward the older man brought back a very deep, primal, motherly terror that my babies were about to be hurt. And when I whispered, "Please don't hurt them," the old man hushed me in that friendly uncle kind of way, and then held out his hand for my son to place the ring onto. After he did, he tried to run back to his sister, but the older man grabbed him by the wrist and jerked him around so he was facing him. My son silently locked up in fear. My husband managed to say, "Please don't," but I mirrored my boy. I was frozen to the spot, praying the man would keep his word now that his ring had been returned. He told my son he wasn't going to hurt him, and then said it wasn't that he had stolen something that was wrong. It was that he stole it from the wrong person. My son stayed silent, staring up at him with those wide, terrified eyes, and the older man laughed again. He leaned forward, gave my son a gentle slap on the cheek, and said, "He's got guts, this kid. Reminds me of a younger version of myself." After he let go of my son's wrist, the older man told him to quiet down his sister, who by then was crying very loudly. The older man then got up and said a bunch of things about there being no hard feelings, how it was all water under the bridge, and how he was sorry for the intrusion. But for me and my husband, we were barely listening. We had each rushed over to the kids as soon as those goons stepped out of the way, comforting them as the men exited the room. The last thing the man said as he walked out was, "Pretend we were never here." Then, as quickly as they had arrived, they were gone. And as you can imagine, the kids were completely distraught, especially my son. He was still 6 years old at the time, so still very much in that sticky-fingered, prone-to-taking-things phase. But after I sent him into the bathroom, he didn't realize what was happening when he came out again, and he didn't want to speak up about finding the ring in case it got us into even more trouble. I made it clear that it was wrong to keep the ring and not mention it to anyone, but I also explained that those were very bad men, and that they would have been cruel to Mommy and Daddy no matter what happened. I didn't want to upset him any more than he already was. It wasn't until later that I gave him a much firmer talk about the consequences of taking things that don't belong to you. In the end, the whole situation was nothing more than a terrible case of bad luck. After going through something so frightening in that motel room, the kids refused to sleep in it. We managed to convince them to sleep in the car, and at that point, it made sense to just get back on the road. My husband and I were full of adrenaline as well, and while we didn't mind the room itself, there was no way either of us would get any real sleep if we stayed. We drove straight to George's parents' house, and even though we apologized for waking them at almost 4:30 in the morning, they completely understood once we told them what had happened. And what happened was probably the single most terrifying experience of my life. One of the few times I truly believed I was about to watch one of my own children be harmed. As a mother, I wouldn't wish that feeling on my worst enemy. It was a kind of terror I can barely put into words, and a kind I am grateful I haven't felt again in all the years since. Story 3. The Woman Next Door. Back when I was still in college, I used to drive home for the holidays. Since my parents lived all the way across the country, the trip took a day and a half and required an overnight stop in a motel. It was one of those single-story L-shaped places that looked like it had been around since the 50s, with rooms that opened directly onto the parking lot. The paint was faded, and it had 2 buzzing neon signs out front that you could hear all night. The place was clean and cheap, and it was almost exactly a 10-hour drive from my college, so it seemed like a reasonable spot to get some rest. During my sophomore year, I pulled in, paid cash for a room, and parked right in front of my door. I dropped my overnight bag inside, checked the room to make sure everything was in order, and then walked back out to my car. As I was locking the door, someone approached the room next to mine. It was a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, and she was looking down at her phone as she walked past. She bumped straight into me, and I was about to mutter an apology out of habit, but she spoke first. Instead of saying sorry, she called me a dumb, filthy name and told me I should watch where I was standing. It was so insane that I was stunned, and I didn't let it bother me. And as Zor walked to my car, I quietly laughed to myself at how comically terrible some people can be. I also remember being super relieved that I was only staying one night, and that I most likely wouldn't have to interact with her again. I had no idea that me and little Miss RDE were in for a much more significant encounter. I drove down to the same fried chicken place that I stopped by during my freshman year and was relieved to find that it was still open. I got myself a sandwich, some fries, and an iced tea. And after going back out into the parking lot, I spotted a man standing by what I assumed was his car. It looked like he was watching the people inside through the big panel windows. The second he saw me, he called out in a friendly voice, asking if I could help him. Then, when I asked what was going on, he told me his story. So, about a week prior, his wife's parents had died in a freak car accident. She was absolutely devastated. But as the days went by, she got worse and worse, until one day, when she seemed to have a complete nervous breakdown and drove off in her car after saying she was going to find her dead parents, like she didn't really believe they were gone. Given what a fragile state of mind his wife was in, the man said he was desperate to find her before she got herself hurt or into trouble. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to show me a picture of her. And when he turned the screen around so I could see, I recognized who it was. It was little Miss RDE, the lady who barged into me outside my motel room maybe only 45 minutes prior. I took a long look at the picture, staying quiet while I studied it. And then, after looking up to meet the man's eyes, I told him, "Nope, sorry, haven't seen her. But if you give me your cell number, I can call you if I do." And I tried to sound as genuine as possible. I took down his cell number before wishing him luck, and then walked back to our cars as he thanked me for my kindness. Now, a lot of you are going to ask, why the hell did you just lie to that nice man searching for his wife? And I get it. I'd be asking the same thing if it was me reading this right now. But right as I was on the cusp of telling the guy, "Good news, I know where she is. She's in the hotel room right next to mine," I heard my friend Megan's voice in my head. Allie, who'd been one of my best friends all throughout high school, had suffered through a horrible dating experience back when she was a senior. She ended up dating an older guy, not by much, just a couple of years. But while this guy seemed cool and had a nice car and had money to spend on her, he turned out to be an absolute psycho who could not take no for an answer. She had to leave her job and find work somewhere else because he kept appearing, trying to yell at her or beg her to take him back. But only a few months after she started at the new place, he showed up there as well. And this time, he wasn't interested in talking. He tried to drag her into his car. The police later said it turned into a major scene. But afterward, when one of her old middle school friends heard about it, she called her in tears and said the entire situation was her fault. The ex-boyfriend had contacted her, told her a string of lies about planning a surprise party, and managed to trick her into revealing where Megan was working now. It was cruel, deceitful, and manipulative, showing exactly why she had needed to end things with him in the first place. So when that man showed me a photo of his wife, after telling me a lot of things I had no way to confirm, I decided it was better to be cautious. It wasn't only Megan's experience that made me lie to him either. There was something about the way he told his story that never felt right to me. It came across as almost rehearsed, and while I would have helped the man if his story had turned out to be true, it is always wiser to be safe than sorry. When I returned to the motel, I walked straight to the door of the room beside mine. and then paused for a few moments before finally knocking. I noticed the curtains shift to the right of me, and then suddenly heard little Miss RDE call out, "What do you want?" She didn't sound angry or unstable, just slightly irritated that I had knocked on her door. Certainly nothing like the emotional collapse her husband had described. When I told her I needed to ask her something, and that it was better to do it face to face, she came to the door and opened it only a crack before peering out at me from the darkness inside. She then asked me again in a much quieter voice what business I had knocking at her door. At that point, I wasn't quite sure what to say at first, or rather, I wasn't sure how to say it. So instead, I simply asked her a question by saying, "Ma'am, did your parents pass away recently?" She only frowned in confusion before telling me no. Her father had died many years earlier, and her mother was still very much alive. It feels insensitive to admit this, given the circumstances. But that sense of vindication, that proof that I had been right to hold back information, felt good. I hadn't been paranoid, and my suspicions had been completely justified. And the woman still had a puzzled expression on her face. So I quickly explained about the man I had met in the parking lot of that chicken restaurant, and how he had shown me a photograph of her. And the moment I said it, her face suddenly fell and went pale. But not only in shock or understanding, she looked more like I had told her the dead were climbing out of their graves. She looked utterly terrified, and after a few moments of silence, she asked me, "Can you come inside?" And after she closed the door behind us, the first thing she did was thank me. And I saw a complete change in this woman's demeanor. She went from cold and distant to gentle and vulnerable, as she explained that she had recently escaped from her abusive husband. It hadn't only been arguments or bad moods, but years of slowly increasing violence. Then, by the time she became afraid he might beat her to death, she knew it was time to leave, and she slipped away while he was at work, with nothing but a suitcase of clothes, some cash, and her car. Hearing about all the abuse she endured made my skin crawl, and when I told her I had lied to him about not seeing her, she looked so relieved that I thought she might cry. I also told her about taking his cell number and joked about how I could throw him off with a false sighting. Now, this was the first time I actually saw her smile, and she laughed weakly before warning me not to get involved. Then, after thanking me a dozen more times, I went back to my room and got ready for bed. I went to sleep feeling good, like I had done something truly meaningful in helping a battered spouse escape her abusive husband. But a couple of hours later, I heard a crash that had me bolting out of bed, terrified. And because in that moment I was half asleep, I first thought that what I heard was a car accident on the highway outside. But I did not even make it to the window before I heard another bang, and it was coming from the room next door, the one with little Miss RDE, or as she should really be called, the wife on the run. I dialed 911 on speaker as I threw on some clothes, telling them what was happening before heading out the door into the parking lot. I had not seen the husband yet, but I did not need to. I knew only one man in the world could be responsible for the things she had screamed, and the only one who would have answered in the way he did. Once I was dressed, I ran out into the parking lot just in time to see the same man from the chicken place parking lot. He had her by the arm, and he was dragging his escaped wife toward a pickup truck. He was dragging her, but she was not on her feet. She was unconscious, her legs scraping against the gravel, and the sight of her ragdoll like that made me feel sick. I started yelling and screaming for him to let her go, for people to help her, and before long, a couple of other motel guests came out of their rooms. One of them, a big guy in flannel pajama pants, ran straight toward them and shouted for him to let go. Another man from farther down the road joined in. The husband swung at one of them, But in the chaos, a third man came at him from the side and shoved him so hard he let go of his wife. After that, he seemed to realize just how outnumbered he was. And after running to his truck, he peeled out of the lot and sped off down the highway. Someone had already called the police, and another guest was on the phone with 911 for an ambulance. And the woman just lay on the ground, still out cold, with her face badly swollen on one side. I started wondering how her husband could have found her, and when it hit me, the realization made me feel twice as sick. He must have seen that I recognized her when he showed me the photo, or maybe he simply sensed the lie for what it was. Then all he had to do was follow me back to the motel at a distance, and he could have watched from afar as I knocked on the door of her room. I made it easy for him. I thought I had been helping her, and instead I had condemned her to face a living nightmare. The cops arrived to secure the area, and not long after, the EMTs showed up and wheeled her away on a stretcher. She was awake by then, but she clearly was not doing well, and I could not bring myself to try to talk to her because of how guilty I felt. I was convinced that I had led her abusive husband straight to her, and I am still convinced that is the truth, even after years and years of trying to tell myself otherwise. After the police and EMTs drove off, the entire place went completely quiet again, and I went back to bed and tried to sleep, but sleep did not come easily. In the morning, I packed my bag and checked out, barely making eye contact with the manager as I did so. I did not ask about the woman, and I could not bring myself to do it. I simply got in my car and drove away. Story 4. Room 14. I have been cleaning rooms at the Cedar Pines Motel for almost 15 years now. It is not a fancy place, just one of those long, single-story motels you see off the highway, the kind with faded green doors and an ice machine that only seems to work when it feels like it. We get a mix of guests. Some are just passing through, and some stay for a couple of weeks, and you learn very quickly not to ask too many questions. It was a quiet afternoon in late September, I remember, and I was coming back from cleaning room 8 when I saw a kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, walking back and forth outside room 14. At first, I thought he was just playing, maybe waiting for his parents to come back from the vending machine. But after a while, I noticed that he was not really playing at all, just pacing up and down. And when I asked him where his mom and dad were, he only shrugged and said he did not know. He did not look scared exactly, more like empty, as if whatever had happened had knocked all the life out of him. After taking the kid by the hand, I went to the office to find Dennis, the clerk on duty. Dennis is the kind of guy who has been doing this job forever and does not get rattled very easily. I told him about the kid, and he checked the logbook. Sure enough, room 14 had been rented the night before to a couple with a child who paid in cash. The three of us then tried knocking on the door of room 14. Dennis knocked, but got no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but there was still nothing. He gave me a nervous look, then went to get his master key. And the smell hit me before the door was even halfway open. Not the heavy, rotting odor you get when something has been dead a long time, but more like the sharp, mitigant tang of fresh blood. The room was a wreck. The bedsheets were tangled and stained. Drawers had been pulled out and clothes thrown all over, and one of the lamps was knocked over and cracked. I saw flecks of blood on one of the walls, little spots like someone had flicked a paintbrush dipped in red. There was more on the bedsheets, so much that we couldn't write it off as a nosebleed or something equally harmless. Dennis swore under his breath, and I stepped back quickly so the kid couldn't see. I put my hands on his shoulders and turned him toward the parking lot, telling him that we were going to wait outside. I tried to keep him talking, asking about school and if he liked cartoons. He barely answered me. It was like he knew what had happened and he couldn't process it yet. The police showed up maybe 20 minutes later. The first 2 deputies went in to search the room, and then, not long after, they were joined by another officer in plain clothes, who I guessed was a detective. And that's when I knew that it must have been something serious. Very serious. They kept asking us the same questions over and over. Things like how we found the kid, what time it was, and if we'd seen anyone come or go. And I told them everything we knew, which wasn't much. Dennis told them about the cash payment and that there was no car listed on the registry. Now, once I was done with the cops, I kept trying to keep the kid distracted. I found some old crayons in the office desk and a few sheets of paper, and he sat at one of the lobby tables and drew pictures while the cops went in and out of the room. At one point, I remember looking over to see what he was drawing and saw it looked like a bed with red scribbles all over it. I don't know if it was my imagination filling in the gaps, but I felt horrible, knowing that he might have seen something happen to his parents. A few guests came by to see what the commotion was, but the cops kept moving them along until one lady, the lady in room 6, said that she thought she'd heard a loud bang in the middle of the night. It had been loud enough to wake her, but since it only happened the one time, she'd figured it was just someone dropping a heavy suitcase or maybe her mishearing something. Only then did she realize that she might have heard something terrible actually happening. It was maybe 2 hours before a woman from Child Protective Services stopped by to see about the kid. She was polite but firm with us, but super sweet and friendly with the kid, as she told him that he needed to go with her to talk to some nice folks over at her office. He didn't ask questions. He just took her hand and followed her to her car. I don't know why, but I knew right then that whatever happened in that room, he wasn't going to see his parents ever again. The police never told us much after that. They took the sheets and the lamp and some clothing and a few other things from the room, and it was sealed for a while. And when I finally got it back to clean, it was completely stripped bare. The mattress was gone, the curtains were gone. Almost everything had been taken away to be examined as evidence. They left a faint outline on the carpet where the bed used to be. And even though I scrubbed for hours, I could still see a shadow of that reddish-brown stain on the wall. Every now and then, I wonder about that kid, if he remembers that day, if he ever found out what happened. I've cleaned plenty of bad messes in my time. Rooms full of garbage, rooms where people overdosed, heck, even rooms where people have died. But there was something different about room 14. Something about the quiet way that boy paced outside like he already knew he was alone. I still work here, and not much has changed. The paint on the doors is even more faded, and the ice machine still doesn't work half the time. But I can't walk past that room without glancing at the door. I half expect to see a small figure waiting there, pacing back and forth, not knowing, or maybe knowing too well, why Mom and Dad are gone forever. Story 5. The Man with the Wigs. For under 5 years, I used to work the front desk at a little motel in the middle of nowhere. It was a quiet place, a little rundown, but Patricia, our cleaner, kept everything sparkling. We used to get hunters in the fall, fishermen in the summer, and the occasional trucker rolling in during the midnight hours. As much as it was mostly a boring job, I came to appreciate the safety and stability. But every so often, we got some real bad men rolling into that old parking lot of ours. And one of them came in the spring of 1996. It was late on a Sunday evening when his car turned into the lot. It had been a quiet day, maybe 4 or 5 check-ins, and I was halfway through a bad cup of coffee when he walked up to the front desk. He looked normal, a regular middle-aged white guy with a big coat and a red wool hat. He was friendly, too, and greeted me warmly before saying he wanted a room for the night. I checked which rooms were free, told him the rate, and then, after he slid a credit card across the counter, I ran it through. But the machine declined it, and he said, "Huh, that's weird. It's been working fine all day." And then he asked me to try the card again. I did, not once, but twice, and both times the card was declined. The guy seemed really embarrassed. He pulled out his wallet as he apologized a bunch, and I told him it was fine as he handed me the cash. Those things happen from time to time, and he didn't have anything to apologize for. He gave me a big smile as he thanked me, and then, after I handed him his key and directed him to room 6, he thanked me again and headed off down the hall. I was working the night shift that night, from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. Aside from watching the place and making sure the vending machine was stocked, all I did was watch movies on the small box TV we kept in the office. I could keep an eye on the parking lot from there, so if guests rolled in, I would see them coming. But that night, when I noticed headlights turning into the lot, I looked up and saw not just one cruiser, but 2 from the Mason County Sheriff's Department. 2 deputies stayed outside, watching all the rooms, while one deputy came inside to ask me about a declined credit card from a few hours earlier. He knew it had been declined 3 times and said he needed to speak to the person who used it. When I mentioned the guy in the red hat, the deputy asked which room he was in, and I led him there. The door was locked, but I gave them the spare key. They opened it slowly with their guns drawn, but the room was empty. The man in the red hat was gone. One of the deputies said he must have been watching the parking lot and slipped out through the rear window when he saw the patrol cars arrive. He left behind nothing but a half-empty bottle of water on the nightstand, a pair of muddy boots by the bed, and the faint smell of something I could not place at first, almost like hair dye or some kind of chemical. The deputies told me to stay out of the room until another group of officers had searched it and collected evidence. A few hours later, I was taking out some trash when I overheard 2 deputies talking to each other, and what I heard made my skin crawl. They said the forensics technician had found a bag in the room, and inside it were a whole bunch of different wigs. The forensics team said they would need to test them to be sure, but at first glance they looked and felt very much like real human hair. But that was not what got to me the most. What truly unsettled me was hearing one of the deputies say that one of the wigs matched the hair of a missing woman who had disappeared only a week or so earlier. I decided I did not want to hear any more. The deputies and the forensics team stayed for a couple of hours. They took the wigs, the boots, and even the water bottle. I heard one of them say they were going to check everything for DNA. When they finally left, the motel went quiet again, but it felt anything but peaceful. Just hours before, someone who might have been a psychopath, a trophy-seeking murderer, had been standing only 3 feet from me. I had handed him a key, smiled at him, and even told him to have a good night. And all the while, maybe inside that bag he was carrying, there was the hair of some missing woman. That thought will stay with me as long as I live. And you should have seen how calm he was, too. You would never have suspected in a million years that he was capable of something like that. No visible nerves, no rush, just still, like he had all the time in the world. And I did not hear much beyond that. The sheriff came back a few days later to ask me more questions, but they still had not caught the guy, and he could not say whether the hair really belonged to that missing woman. But I could tell by the way he talked that it was probably bad. After that, every time someone walked through that door to check in, I watched them a little differently. I still think about that man a whole lot, actually, because I know people like him do not just exist in movies or on the news now. They walk through the front door with a big old smile on their face, pretending to be someone they are not, and you have no way of knowing who they really are until it is too late.